Welcome to the LuckyShots podcast with your host, Ricky Larson, presented by LuckyShots Media.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into the LuckyShots podcast. I am your host, Ricky Larson, and folks, it's playoffs time. As we start the fantasy playoffs, we have to reflect on a great and crazy year of the regular season, and how would we do that? With an award show, of course. So we will be looking at the regular season and all of that by giving out awards. We'll get that to a little later, but right now we're going to look at our Week 13 Boomers.
Boom, boom. Players of the week, baby.
Starting at the quarterback position, a guy that I have talked about for quite a few weeks as a waiver wire guy, somebody to pick up because he was going to have good matchups. Derek Carr. He's the number one quarterback on the week with 31.74 fantasy points. And he's got some more good matchups, so he's somebody else that, if he's still out there, go pick him up. The number two quarterback this week was Josh Allen with 30.1 fantasy points. Another big game from him, which kind of hurts my feelings a little bit. Traded him away for Justin Herbert, and the point differential was big this week. At the number three quarterback, we have Baker Mayfield with 29.46 fantasy points, and it is officially 2020 when the Browns are scoring 41 points in a game, and when they're actually going to have a winning season and probably make the playoffs. But Baker Mayfield, another great game. Number four, Ryan Tannehill with 27.56 fantasy points, and rounding out your top five was Matt Stafford with 26.08 fantasy points. Moving on to the running backs, David Montgomery was your number one running back this week with 27.1 fantasy points. That came as a shock to probably everybody, including people who have David Montgomery on their rosters. Montgomery always has good matchups that you expect him to do well in, and just never takes advantage of that. But this week, he turned it into 27.1 fantasy points, so great showing from him. At number two, we have Dalvin Cook with 23.9 fantasy points. He's a top five guy all the time, just very good. At number three, we have Aaron Jones with 23.8 fantasy points. At number four, James Robinson with 22.8 fantasy points. Contender for Rookie of the Year. Just absolutely great season. And then at number five, you have Jonathan Taylor with 22.5 fantasy points, which is a good sign. But you still don't know who to trust in that Colts backfield. This week it's Jonathan Taylor. A few weeks ago it was Nyheim Hines. Some weeks before that it was Jordan Wilkins. You still just don't know who to trust in that backfield, but Jonathan Taylor with a great week. For your wide receivers, the number one wide receiver was Corey Davis with 35.2 fantasy points. And again, that hurt my feelings. He was on my bench. Sad day for me. But makes it a little better because the number two wide receiver was Justin Jefferson with 27.3 fantasy points, and I have him rostered and started in both of my leagues. Fantastic. Another Rookie of the Year candidate. At number three, Marvin Jones Jr. with the 25.6 fantasy points, and another shock in the top 10 here, but T.Y. Hilton at number four with 25 fantasy points. Stinker all year, came out and actually did something this week. Maybe he gets it going through your fantasy playoffs, but I wouldn't count on it. Then at number five, you have Kiki QT with 22.1 fantasy points. You wondered who was going to step up for the Texans with Will Fuller being out. after, being suspended for using PEDs. And Kiki QT was that guy this week. And from what I hear, he's the one you should expect to take over that role for Houston. So, again, he's a guy that is on waivers. So go look and see if he's there. Plug him in. Then at the tight end position, you had Darren Waller at number 1. Talk about a shocker. Travis Kelce is not the number 1 tight end this week. But Darren Waller scored 45 fantasy points. He was the main target for Derek Carr and Derek Carr's number 1 quarterback week. And he benefited with 45 points. 200 yards, 2 touchdowns. Great game for him. Then at number 2, we have Travis Kelce with 27.6 fantasy points. Logan Thomas at number 3 with 24.8 fantasy points. Also had him on my bench, but he's a guy you can expect to at least get 10 points every week, but a 24-point week wasn't something you would see. So we'll see if that continues throughout the fantasy playoffs. At number 4, you have Mike Gesicki with 23.8 fantasy points. And at number 5, you have Dan Arnold. He had 20.1 fantasy points, a tight end for the Arizona Cardinals. And if I remember right, one of his touchdowns actually came off of like a fumble recovery that he picked up and ran in for a touchdown or something like that. Or it might have been a deep pass, but he only had 2 catches, but still put him in the top 5 for the tight ends this week. Defensively, your number 1 defense was the New England Patriots, scoring 28 points, which really hurt me this week in fantasy because I have Justin Herbert in both leagues. I have Hunter Henry in my league of record to pair with Justin Herbert. And I have Keenan Allen in my secondary league to pair with Justin Herbert. And they all threw up relatively goose egg numbers this week and nearly lost me a 7-game winning streak in my secondary league. But the Patriots defense just went out there and played absolutely great and shut down the Chargers in their 45-0 win this last week. Number 2, you had the Dolphins scoring 16 fantasy points. At number 3, you had the Rams with 13 fantasy points. At number 4, you had the Giants, who pulled off some sort of crazy upset against the Seahawks, but their defense scored 12 points. And the Packers defense at number 5 also scored 12 points. Moving on to our kickers, you had Harrison Butker with 17 fantasy points in a game with the Broncos that was actually a lot closer than anybody probably expected. And as a Broncos fan, it was exciting to watch, but I also knew we still weren't going to win that game. Harrison Butker, the main reason for that, he went out there and kicked a lot of field goals, scored most of their points. There was also some questionable calls in that game. The Tyreek Hill deep touchdown pass that was incomplete, but he caught it, but the Chiefs didn't challenge it. And then Harrison Butker came on and kicked a field goal. But a great week from him. At number 2, Dustin Hopkins with 14 points. Number 3, Jason Sanders, 14 points as well. At 4, Cody Parkey with 12 points. And at number 5, Younghoe Koo with 12 points as well. That is it for your Boomers of the Week. Now it is time, ladies and gentlemen. I would officially like to welcome you to the Lucky Shots Podcast 2020 Fantasy Football Awards Show.
In a world of confusion and mystery, these players have given light to a dark world. This is the 2020 Lucky Shots Podcast Awards Show with your host, Ricky Larson.
All right, welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to the Lucky Shots Podcast Awards Show. I am your host, Ricky Larson, and these first few awards are going to be, the basic best quarterback, running back, all of those awards. And then we have some special awards thought up by yours truly for some truly special or very not special players this fantasy season. So without further ado, your best quarterback this regular season for the fantasy football leagues that you are in is Patrick Mahomes. He had 3,815 passing yards, 31 passing touchdowns, 2 rushing touchdowns, and only 2 interceptions. He was the quarterback 1 throughout the regular season and averaged 25.9 fantasy points per game. So Patrick Mahomes, your best quarterback winner. Some notable mentions for that award. You had Aaron Rodgers, who has more passing touchdowns, but doesn't score as many points as Patrick Mahomes. Then you had Russell Wilson, who honestly could have won all of the awards that had anything to do with a quarterback had he not fallen off about midway through the regular season. Then you had Josh Allen kind of in that same boat. But, Josh Allen, with the way he played this past week, could turn into your fantasy playoffs MVP if he continues to do what he did this past week. And then Kyler Murray, who honestly just is having a great year, running the ball, passing the ball, just looking very, very good at that quarterback position. But again, can't really go against Patrick Mahomes in the terms of as a quarterback when your touchdown to interception ratio is 31-2. So that is that. Let's move on to the best running back award. And that award goes to Dalvin Cook. He had 1,250 rushing yards with 13 rushing touchdowns and averaged 5 yards per carry during the regular season of your playoffs. He also had 35 receptions for 314 yards and a receiving touchdown. He is the running back 2 throughout the regular season, but averages 25 points per game. And honestly, he gets this award because he just had some of those weeks that he had to put his entire offense on his back and played absolutely great. Had some monster weeks that, regardless of how the rest of your fantasy team did, you probably won because you had Dalvin Cook score about 30 to 50 points in a few different weeks. So your best running back is Dalvin Cook. Some notable mentions here: James Robinson, who is another Rookie of the Year candidate, and just came out of nowhere and has played extremely well for a Jacksonville team that has not been all that great. He also had Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, and Aaron Jones, all guys that easily could have won this award as well. Aaron Jones more probably could not have out of these 4 notable mentions, as he missed a couple games and just his utilization in the Packers offense is not all that great. It is time for your best wide receiver award, and that award goes to Tyreek Hill. He had 74 receptions, 1,079 receiving yards, and 13 receiving touchdowns, along with 90 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown this regular season, making him the number 1 wide receiver throughout the regular season. He averaged 22.9 fantasy points per game, and he's another guy that, I didn't put the stat in here of how many deep connections he had, but it was somewhere around like 17 deep plays this year. And of course, a couple weeks ago with 3 deep touchdown plays against Tampa Bay, having 200 yards in the first quarter. Just absolutely an animal. And with Patrick Mahomes, that whole offense, if we had a best offense award, it would just go to the Kansas City Chiefs. But Tyreek Hill is your best wide receiver of the 2020 season. Some other notable mentions are Devontae Adams, Keenan Allen, Adam Thielen, and DK Metcalf, all other guys that had great years, especially Devontae Adams, probably the closest thing to Tyreek Hill as a wide receiver, but just the dynamic plays of Tyreek Hill gave him the upper hand, in my opinion, for the best wide receiver. Moving on to your best tight end award, and that tight end award goes to Travis Kelce, obviously. He had 82 receptions for 1,114 receiving yards and 8 receiving touchdowns. The tight end won through the regular season, averaging 20 points per game. And with the way everything shook out as for the tight ends this season, I mean, Travis Kelce still probably would have been your number one, but you had just a dumpster fire at tight end. And Travis Kelce is always just a good option at tight end. Probably the only lock-it option for tight ends. And, I mean, he didn't disappoint this year. If you were a Travis Kelce owner, you were doing a touchdown dance all the time. Travis Kelce, your tight end of the year. Some notable mentions, you had Darren Waller, George Kittle, TJ Hawkinson, and Robert Tonyan. Darren Waller coming off that 45-point game. George Kittle could have given Travis Kelce a run for his money, I believe, for this award, had he not gotten hurt and been forced out. But Travis Kelce is just the clear number one at that position. So he is your best tight end of the year. Moving on to the best defense award. That award goes to the Pittsburgh Steelers. They forced 16 interceptions, 7 fumbles, only allowed 199 average passing yards per game, and 100.7 average rushing yards per game. And as a defense, they scored 3 touchdowns this season. They only averaged giving up about 17.6 points per week to opposing offenses, and they themselves averaged 10.6 fantasy points per game. This season, they had 7 10-plus point fantasy games, making them the number one defense in fantasy and giving them the best defensive award of the 2020 season. Some other notable mentions for this award, you had the Saints, the Rams, the Colts, and the Dolphins. I mean, honestly, if you had any of these defenses throughout the season, you were happy with it. But if you had the Steelers, they had some times where they possibly were winning you weeks. So the Pittsburgh Steelers defense is your best defense of the 2020 season. Moving on to your best kicker award, we have Young-Ho Koo. The kicker for the Atlanta Falcons, he only missed 1 field goal this season, going 32 of 33 on his field goals. He did miss 3 extra points, going 23 of 26 on those, but he was 8 for 8 from 20 yards, 10 for 10 at 30 yards, 7 for 8 from 40 yards, and 7 of 7 from 50-plus yard range. He averaged at least 12.6 fantasy points per game and was the number one kicker in fantasy throughout these 13 weeks. And Young-Ho Koo, just an animal, man. Great kicker. And, you know, if your kicker is averaging you 12 points a week, I mean, that's more than you're probably getting from your tight ends, to be honest. So Young-Ho Koo is your best kicker of the year. Some notable mentions for this award, you had Jason Sanders, Dan Carlson, Tyler Bass, and Graham Gano. Moving on from positions, we move on to the Rookie of the Season. With this one, I'm going to give you the notable mentions first and see if maybe by the end of notable mentions, you can figure out who I have for the rookie of the season. So your notable mentions, you have Justin Herbert, who stepped in, week 2 or week 3 on a 5-minute notice. He came in, and he has been tearing it up ever since. Then you had James Robinson, who honestly was in both of my leagues was a waiver wire pickup, and has come out and been one of the top running backs this season as a rookie. Just a great season from him. Then you had Chase Claypool, who came out somewhere midway through the regular season, had a 4-touchdown game, had 10 touchdowns in a 10-game span, and has just turned into a great target for Big Ben as a rookie. And then T. Higgins, who also didn't get an early start, but came in and he was a consistent flex play, sometimes even a wide receiver 2 play. But all of those guys are not your rookie of the year. Your rookie of the year is Justin Jefferson. He is the wide receiver 7 throughout the regular season, averaging 17.4 fantasy points per game, and has 61 receptions on 84 targets, only had played 12 games. And honestly, he came in and played extremely well every single week. He has 1,039 receiving yards, which I believe leads the Minnesota Vikings receivers, and 7 touchdowns. Can't say enough about Justin Jefferson. He was a guy who I picked up in both of my leagues off of the waiver wire, and I think I maybe took him out once based on just other players that are just as good having better matchups. But other than that, Justin Jefferson has been plugged into my lineup since I picked him up off of waivers, and I haven't regretted it at all ever since. Moving on to your Offensive Player of the Year award. This guy just absolutely murders it every single week. It is Davante Adams, averaging 26.29 fantasy points per game, and he's only played 10 games this season, but has scored 262 total fantasy points throughout the season, and is the wide receiver 2 throughout the regular season. But here is where he earns this Offensive Player of the Year. He has 1 20-point game, 3 30-point games, and 2 40-point games. So 6 of the 10 games he has played have been 20 points or more and have been boom weeks for you. And he has 13 touchdowns on the season, which is more than a touchdown per game that he has played. Some other notable mentions, we had Dalvin Cook, Tyreek Hill, Patrick Mahomes, and Aaron Rodgers. But when you come in and you have, as a non-quarterback, more than 1 touchdown a game, and you have 6 of your 10 games being big-time weeks, there's nobody else you would have put in over Davante Adams in the 10-game span that he was in. So, Davante Adams is your Offensive Player of the Year. Now we're going to move on to some Lucky Shots podcast fabricated awards, but rewards nonetheless. We're going on to the Golden Toilet Award. This award goes to somebody who you drafted high, thought they were going to be great, and for one reason or another, they just were garbage. Absolutely terrible. And that year, it was Michael Thomas. His average draft position this season was number 6 and was the number 1 wide receiver in most fantasy drafts. As of right now, at the end of the regular season for fantasy, he is the number 88 wide receiver. He only averages 11.9 points per game this season and has 0 touchdowns. And just to compound all of that, he has missed 6 games. it's just awful. Absolutely awful for Michael Thomas. He is definitely a guy you drafted thinking, oh yeah, I'm getting the top wide receiver this year. I've got it. And he has just not shown up at all this season. So, Mr. Michael Thomas, sit on your golden toilet because you get this award. Some other notable mentions, you had Julio Jones, Carson Wentz, T.Y. Hilton, and I even put Saquon Barkley on here just because I am very upset with him. He was my number one pick, got hurt right away, screwed up the whole season for me, and I had to do a lot of work to figure things out in his absence. Moving on to the Touchdown Dance Award, the man that's going to give you the most touchdowns throughout any week, it's Aaron Rodgers. He has 36 touchdowns through the regular season, which leads all players. And averages 3 touchdowns per game, and he has 5 4-touchdown games this season. And every game he has played, except for one, were multi-touchdown games, 2 or more. Just an absolutely great season for him. And through 12 or 13 games, that's about 3 touchdowns per game. You know, I mean, he's automatic, and especially when he got Davante Adams back, every one of those touchdowns is going to Davante Adams. So that is a deadly duo right there. But Aaron Rodgers is your Touchdown Dance Award winner this season. The next award is pretty fun. It is called the Just Here to Make the Defense Look Good Award.
Listen,
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm kind of retarded.
And that award goes to Carson Wentz. You want to know why? It's because he has 15 interceptions, 9 fumbles, and has been sacked 50 times in 13 games. He goes out there to make the defense look good. Defenses against him average 10.85 fantasy points per week, and they average 1 interception, 4.5 sacks, and 1 fumble per game against Carson Wentz. Some notable mentions for this award are the entire Dallas Cowboys offense, the entire Jets offense, or the entire Broncos offense. All of those offenses make your defense look good. But Carson Wentz, he leads that tribe. And he is your Just Here to Make the Defense Look Good award winner. Moving on to the Golden Hands Award. My criteria for this award was who catches the ball the most without it being incomplete, and that actually turned out to be Cole Beasley this year. He only has 66 receptions, but it's on 82 targets, meaning there's only been 16 incompletions when going his way this season. Just very reliable, and he's turning into a guy that if you somehow have him or he's still on the waiver wire and you can pick him up, he's a guy that could win you some fantasy championships. The way Josh Allen has been going to him throughout the past few weeks, and especially this past week, Cole Beasley is a definite fantasy sleeper for your playoffs. Some other notable mentions, you had Keenan Allen, Travis Kelce, and Adam Thielen. They're all just so heavily targeted, and they catch the ball just about every time it comes to them. But on a basis of the least amount of incompletions, it goes to Cole Beasley. The next award is the Highest Medical Bill Award, which I guess I'll just read off some of your... Well, no, actually, I don't even have a notable mention here because it's Christian McCaffrey. He was the number 1 draft pick in, I'm going to say almost every league, but maybe a few. But he has missed 6 games with an ankle injury, 3 games with a shoulder injury, and this comes at such a high price because he's averaging 30.1 points per game in the 3 games that he has played this season. But he's been out for 9 of your 13 weeks. And as your number one running back, yeah, I'm sure it's been a big bill that you've had to pay and figure out how to maneuver around Christian McCaffrey being out. But your highest medical bill award goes to Christian McCaffrey. Moving on to the Steal of the Year award. This is an award that, it's probably somebody you picked up off the waiver wires, didn't realize they were going to be great until they were. Some notable mentions for this award are James Robinson, Chase Claypool, and Justin Jefferson. But for me, and this one does hit home with me, and I don't care if it's biased, but my Steal of the Year award goes to Justin Herbert. He began the season as the quarterback 35, and if your draft was even this big, he was the number 318 player in most fantasy drafts. He is now quarterback number 8 and has averaged 21.8 points per game this season, with 8 multi-touchdown games and 6 300-yard passing games. Came in week 2, didn't have really any preparation, came in and just played absolutely phenomenal and has played so great throughout the rest of the season. And, you probably didn't see it coming. So Justin Herbert is your Steal of the Year award winner. And now, moving on to your regular season MVP, not a shock, it's Patrick Mahomes. He leads all players in fantasy points scored with 310.7. He's probably on his way to another NFL MVP, another great year for him. But Patrick Mahomes is your regular season MVP. Folks, that wraps up your award show with Lucky Shots Podcast. Thank you for joining, and now we're moving on to matchups.
Playoffs? Talk about playoffs? You kidding me? Playoffs? I just hope we can win a game.
So some week winning matchups this week. Just some players and their matchups that could be huge for your fantasy teams this week. Starting at quarterback, you have Justin Herbert coming off of a very down week, probably his worst week in football in his life. But he's playing Atlanta this week, who's ranked 31st against fantasy quarterbacks, giving up 27 points per game to them. And Justin Herbert, again, averages 21.8 fantasy points per game. I think this is a bounce-back week for Justin Herbert, and the matchup against Atlanta, who just loves being torched by quarterbacks, I think Justin Herbert goes out there and puts up about the 27 that Atlanta normally gives up, which could be a huge game-winning effort for your fantasy team. Then you have Russell Wilson, who's been a wee bit shaky throughout the past few weeks, but he's playing the New York Jets, who are 29th against quarterbacks and give up an average of 24.67 fantasy points to quarterbacks per week. And Russell Wilson averages about 24 points per game, so he's sitting right on that line. Honestly, I think Russell Wilson could go well over this 24-point margin. We'll just have to see how much they let Russ cook against a terrible Jets defense. And then you have Aaron Rodgers taking on Detroit, who's 26th against quarterbacks. They give up an average of 21.17 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. And Aaron Rodgers, with Devontae Adams, scores about 23.6 fantasy points per week. So Aaron Rodgers, I think, will go out there and rip apart Detroit and win you some matchups in your first round of the playoffs. Moving on to running backs, you have Aaron Jones, also against Detroit, but Detroit is 32nd to running backs. They give up 26.67 fantasy points per game, and Aaron Jones this season is averaging 19.3 fantasy points. So this is a great matchup, a matchup that could win you some weeks, but it is up to Green Bay to give Aaron Jones the football and not split it so much with Jamal Williams and whoever else they feel like giving the ball to. They need to trust Aaron Jones and give him the ball and let the man work. Last week, had Aaron Jones not ripped off a 70-yard touchdown, he would have had another mediocre week because they were splitting pretty much right down the middle with him and Jamal Williams. So Aaron Jones, if they give him the ball, he's going to tear up Detroit and look absolutely amazing and light up the scoreboard for your fantasy playoffs. Then we have Derrick Henry against Jacksonville, who is 28th against running backs, giving up 20.3 fantasy points to running backs per week, and Derrick Henry averages 18.9 per week. It's getting to be that time of the year. It's getting to be the time of the Yeti season, and Derrick Henry, I think, is going to take advantage of a weak Jacksonville defense and tear through that ceiling for your fantasy team, and he's going to give you a great week. And then you got James Robinson. I've talked about him quite a bit this show as a notable rookie of the year, a notable steal of the year, a notable running back of the year. He's playing Tennessee this week, who's 26th against running backs, giving up 20.17 points per week. And Robinson is averaging 18.7 points per game, and he doesn't really split anything in that backfield. It's all for him. I think he can get to that 20 points or maybe even more against Tennessee this week. And then moving on to wide receivers, you have Keenan Allen. I'm really excited. I think a stack of Keenan Allen and Justin Herbert, or Hunter Henry, who we'll get to later, and Justin Herbert. I am really counting on those two stacks to push me through this first week of the fantasy playoffs, and I think it will because they are playing Atlanta. Atlanta is also 31st against receivers, giving up 27.2 fantasy points per game to wide receivers, and Keenan Allen averages 18.5 fantasy points per week. Again, they're coming off a really down week, and I think it's going to just be a fireworks show for the Chargers throwing the football this week. So Justin Herbert, Keenan Allen, Hunter Henry, I'll get to him later, but those are all going to be huge for your fantasy weeks. Then you have DK Metcalf on top of Russell Wilson against the New York Jets, who are 27th to wide receivers, giving up an average of 24.67 fantasy points per game. And DK Metcalf is averaging 18.9 fantasy points per game. I think this gigantic man is going to make the Jets look silly and hopefully get the rest of their coaching staff fired. But DK Metcalf, I think, is going to be one of those guys that you're just looking at the top 10 next week and you're like, man, what a game. Then you have Adam Thielen against Tampa Bay, who is 26th to wide receivers, giving up an average of 24.83 points per game. Adam Thielen averages 18.6. And I wanted to put Justin Jefferson on here as well, but Adam Thielen obviously is going to be the lead with only about 24 points to give up. I think he takes probably a bulk of that, but I also think Justin Jefferson is a great play. But Adam Thielen against Tampa Bay, I think he is going to most definitely catch at least a touchdown and give you some great fantasy value. Moving on to tight end, you have Hunter Henry against Atlanta, who is also 31st to tight ends, giving up an average of 9.5 fantasy points per game. And Hunter Henry averages 9.8 points per game himself. But I think that he gets at least to like a 15-point mark this week. I think he gets a touchdown. I think he gets quite a few receptions and gets a few yards. I think he gets about 15 points this week. But that is all dependent on if Keenan Allen is the only target, which we have seen before. Then you have Eric Ebron taking on Buffalo, who is 29th to tight ends, giving up an average of 9.17 points per game to them. Ebron is averaging 9.9 fantasy points per game, and with the Steelers coming off of their first loss of the season to a team like Washington, I think this is going to be an angry team, and they're going to come out here and throttle Buffalo, and I think they're going to have to do it through the air because their running game isn't there, and Eric Ebron will just be one of the beneficiaries of that. And then maybe a questionable one, but Noah Fant playing Carolina, who's 23rd to tight ends this season, giving up an average of 7.5 fantasy points to them. Fant averages 9.7 fantasy points per game. And, I mean, he is one of the main targets for the Broncos. And if Drew Lock gets in trouble, which he does, hopefully he will be looking down to Noah Fant and getting him the ball, because he is probably their best receiver besides Tim Patrick on that team. Moving on to the defenses, you have the Seahawks versus the New York Jets, and the New York Jets are 32nd against defenses. They are the worst offense in the NFL, and they give up an average of 12.78 fantasy points to defenses. Now, this is kind of scary because it is the Seahawks defense, who's not been all that great. They only average 3.5 points per game, but it is the Jets. The Jets will turn the ball over. They will throw interceptions. They will fumble, and they won't score a whole lot either. So I believe the Seahawks defense will be one of those top defenses this next week. Moving on, you got the Panthers defense against the Denver Broncos, who are 31st in the league in offense. They give up an average of 12.2 fantasy points per game to defenses. And again, the Panthers aren't all that great of a defense, only averaging 4.3 points per game. But the Broncos do have Drew Lock, and Drew Lock is colorblind and will throw the Panthers a couple of interceptions. And the Panthers have a guy that I really like, Jeremy Chin, who, was it last week or the week before, scored 2 touchdowns in 10 seconds on defense. So I believe the Panthers can force those turnovers, possibly turn them into defensive touchdowns, and give the Panthers a great defensive week. And then you got the Saints against the Philadelphia Eagles, who are the 30th offense in the league. Philly gives up an average of 10.8 fantasy points per game to defenses, and the Saints are one of the better defenses with 8.6 points per game. And they're playing the just out here to make the defense look good award winner, but they are not actually. Jalen Hurts is the starter for the Eagles this week. So we will just have to see in Jalen Hurts' first full game action, what that will look like. But I think the Saints are going to make it very tough on him, and they're going to have another great week. Ladies and gentlemen, that is it this week for your fantasy football show on LuckyShots podcast. Thank you for joining me this week. Good luck in your fantasy playoffs. Bring home some fantasy championships to the listener base. Wish me luck. I am the number 4 seed in both of my leagues. and I play the same person in both of my leagues this week. So, wish me luck. I wish you all luck. Good luck in the playoffs, and let's bring home some championships.
Brand new banger.
You've been listening to the Lucky Shots podcast. Make sure to like, subscribe, and tune in next week for more content.